Do you live, eat, and sleep the hotel industry? Looking to brush up on your game? You've come to the right place. Welcome to No Vacancy, the hospitality industry's #1 podcast, with your host, Glenn Hausman.
Hey everybody, and welcome to a special episode of the No Vacancy podcast with me, Glenn Hausman. I know I'm sounding not like I typically do, but that's because of all of the stuff that's been happening out there in the world lately when it comes to security. And of course, what's on most of our minds is the recent horror that happened in Las Vegas. And it's got us thinking about how can we try to stay more safe in a world that appears to be becoming ever more safe over time. And that's why I brought in today to talk for the special show Mr. Mac Segal. He's the head of fixed site and hotel security consulting, AS Solution out of Denmark. Hello, sir. How are you today?
Good day, Glenn. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, and if for all of you, I encourage you to look way back in the archives, right when we first got the show started in June of 2016. I think you were on the show in about July of 2016. So it's while it's lovely to have you back, I'm sorry it has to be under such circumstance. But thanks again for speaking with us today.
It's a pleasure.
Okay, so the big question that I think we all have is, can we change hotel security in any meaningful way in the future? But before we get into that, maybe you could just tell me what your opinion is on the state of hotel security, where we are today, and how we should be thinking about it.
Okay, yeah. So we'll get back to your first question afterwards. In terms of hotel security, when we look at the Western world, it's very different to Africa or the Middle East, for example.
Right.
But that's fair enough because they face a very different threat level. Mm-hmm. Everything we do in security has to be risk-based, has to be in correlation to the probable and critical threats that a hotel will face in whatever environment it is. So a hotel in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso obviously has different issues to a hotel in Atlanta.
Correct.
So until now, the fact that U.S. hotels or hotels in Western Europe haven't taken security really past petty theft, drunks in the bar, vandalism has been their main concern. I don't think Western hotels have ever considered terrorism as a probable threat.
They did, I think, for about 20 minutes in September of 2001. I mean, I don't mean to make light on it, but there was a big move towards that. And I remember hotels in D.C. being cordoned off, and you would have to go through this method and that method. And in the way that the Western world lives, it wasn't practical, and we kind of moved on from that pretty darn quickly, right?
Correct. So that tends to happen a lot, unfortunately, in the Western world. We have very short memories. Mm-hmm. So exactly, for the 10 minutes after the attack, suddenly there are all these additional security measures, but 3-6 months later, they've all disappeared. And that's not really rational, because the likelihood of an attack, the week after an attack is probably less likely, but in a year from now, it might well happen again. We saw that with the vehicular attacks that we're seeing in Europe and in Canada. They're happening with more and more frequency. It's what we call an emerging threat. Right. It's something we didn't worry about before, except in Israel, where they've been having them for years. But the Western world didn't worry about a terror attack being carried out with a vehicle until it emerged as a threat and happened a few times. And then they started putting up concrete barricades and bollards and putting more armed police on the streets in response to that threat. Yes,
very true. In the summer in New York City in Times Square, there was an incident where somebody deliberately ran some people down. And I happened to have been, I just walked through Times Square 5 minutes before that, heard what happened. And then literally the next day, they put up all of those cement barricades. So it seems there's a lot of correcting things after.
Look, they have the bollards and they have the rapid response armed units because the only way to stop somebody who's using a vehicle as an attack method is unfortunately with force.
Right.
It's very hard to mitigate everything. And that's, if you don't mind me sliding into your second question.
Go for it. Mm-hmm.
Nearly every article that I have read since the Las Vegas shooting has been discussing hotel security. And as a hotel security subject matter expert, I have to point something out.
Please.
The hotel was not attacked.
Mm-hmm.
The hotel was not the target.
Right.
No guest was injured or threatened in any shape or any form. The only person from the hotel who was injured was that incredibly brave security person who approached the door and got shot in the leg for his efforts.
Right.
That incredibly courageous and brave young man. But other than him, the hotel was not attacked. So that's the first thing we have to remember over here.
And that's hard. That's hard for Americans to do. We have a hard time differentiating nuance in this country, I think, to begin with. So a great point. Please continue.
So that's the first thing. When they start speaking about how did he get 23 guns up there, and it's just a moot point.
It is a moot point, and it's easy. I've come in and out of Las Vegas with tons of video equipment. Nobody's ever looked in my bags or thought about it. I could make 20 different trips if I wanted to, and to bring one gun up at a time. So you're right. It's moot.
It's moot. And if he had one gun up there with 1,000 rounds, would it have been better?
Right.
Would the attack not have happened if he only got one gun up?
Right.
He didn't shoot 23 guns, and he had explosives in his car.
Right.
So he could have wired his car and detonated in the parking lot. Or he could have just run down people while they were entering or leaving. The attack in Nice
Right.
killed 86 people with a semi-trailer. A guy with a truck killed more people than Stephen Paddock with a truck. So
Right.
there's always a weapon. There's always a weapon. And if we say, okay, so you can't come into a hotel with a firearm, so he'll rent an Airbnb apartment across from the next festival and use it, or he'll shoot out of his car, right?
Right. Of course.
So this kind of hyper-focus that we're seeing on putting up metal detectors and magnetometers and no guns in the hotel policy, again, the hotel wasn't attacked.
Right.
And by preventing a gunman coming into my hotel with his weapon isn't going to keep if that's his modus operandi, to fire out of my hotel room window at innocent people, well, he can do that from his car or from Starbucks or from anywhere else.
Yeah.
So the hotel industry right now is kind of this knee-jerk response, but I feel like they're not really thinking it through. The question is, what happened here, right? I would have liked to have seen many more articles coming out on event security,
Right.
and emergency procedures. One of the questions, for example, which I'm asking in an article which I'll put out in the next couple of days, is how many of those killed and injured were killed and injured as a result of being trampled or knocked over or stood on in the panic to evacuate?
Right. I have no idea.
No one's saying a word. And it doesn't make it any less tragic. And
Correct.
It doesn't mean that the suspect is not culpable for those deaths and injuries as well. He
Right.
for sure is. However, if 200 of the 500 people were injured because they were trampled and knocked down and run over by other people, right? That's an important thing we need to know, because that might say, you know what, we really also need to re-examine the emergency procedures at such events and the evacuation options. And maybe we need to rethink event security and emergency procedures as well.
So while there's a certain sense of you can't stop that random stuff from happening, there is sometimes stuff that you can do to deal with the after effects of something that hasn't been fully addressed.
Correct. The way in professional jargon, what we speak about is this mitigation, right? But if the mitigation fails, then there's containment and control, right? So how do you contain the damage? How do you minimize the damage? And then how do you control, how do you neutralize the threat? Because the quickest way to keep the public safe is to remove the threat, not to remove the public.
Right.
Right? It's much quicker to just remove one guy than to try and move the 1,000 people he's shooting at. If I remove him, then we don't have a problem anymore.
Right. Absolutely.
So, so we're going to see changes in hotel security. I don't think it's going to be, the physical changes are going to be long-lasting. What I really hope we're going to see is a lot more training.
Right.
A lot more training in things like suspicious indicators. And so far, I've not heard from anyone in the hotel. Often after incidents like this, Glenn, you hear somebody say, Yeah, that guy, we thought he was strange, you know.
Yeah.
There was something weird about that guy. We haven't really heard that, I must say, in this case. We
No,
haven't.
it seems to be quite the opposite. With Steve
Correct.
Wynn coming out and saying that this person, was not really looked at because he seemed to be a normal person. I don't mean to confuse what happened with MGM Resorts with Wynn Resorts, but apparently he was a guest of Wynn at some points as well.
Yes. I saw the interview.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there weren't necessarily indicators. Usually, in 95% of the cases, in a case like this, there are indicators. The person does display behavior, whether it's he barricades himself in his room, he only orders room service, he never
Right.
comes out, he pays in cash, he's very aggressive, whatever it is, they're indicators. And what I hope we will see now is hotels investing a little bit more in training their staff, one, in noticing suspicious indicators. And an indicator doesn't mean because the guy's got a gun, unless you have a no-gun policy, but in behavioral indicators. And the other thing is in emergency procedures. I give a lecture which is called Then What?
Yeah.
Because when it comes to emergency procedures, very often the hotels don't think down to a fine enough resolution. So then when it all goes south, no one really knows what to do. And I'll give you an example again, and I absolutely am against Monday morning quarterbacking these events. If you weren't there, if you weren't on the ground, you don't get to say the police should have done that, the hotel should have done this, the event should have done that. Because from my experience, unless you were there, you really do not have all the facts.
No.
And you don't know what influenced the decisions made on the ground at that time. And to start saying shoulda, woulda, coulda is just not fair. It's not okay.
Right.
But for example, in a country like Israel, where they deal with terrorism on a very regular basis, there's armed security in all hotels. It's covert. The armed security is not visible. Nobody walks around with big weapons and bulletproof vests. It's all concealed.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But the security officers are very, very highly trained. They're ex-military, etc.
Well, it seems like everybody there is ex-military, which does absolutely help. I happen to have gone to Israel this summer, so I know a little bit about what you are speaking of.
Right.
And I found Israel to be much safer feeling than I anticipated before I got on that airplane to head over there. I actually feel more stress going through a New York airport than I did anywhere that I did, including the Western Wall and other holy sites in Israel, than I would have expected.
Yeah, that's interesting that you felt that. And a lot of people have said that because the security is much lower key and much more polite and much more user-friendly and much more effective, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
But it's also because they've been doing it every day for 70 years.
Yeah.
You get real good at it. So if a similar event had happened in a hotel in Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we look at just a terror attacks that have occurred here, within probably 1 to 2 minutes, armed security would have been up there in the room and ended the threat.
Right.
Because that's just how it's functioned. Because they're empowered to do that. They're legally entitled to do that. It's within their authority as security officers. Mm-hmm. And they're trained to do that. And they know what to do when it all goes wrong.
Right.
And we need to invest, like in the States, much more effort in training. And I've said it to you before, and I'll say it again. A hotel will have no problem spending $300,000 on cameras, but they won't spend $30,000 on training.
Right. Which is kind of a weird thing. Yeah. A camera's only going to help you pretty much, I think, when it's too late. Right?
Correct.
Yeah.
No camera has ever stopped a gunman.
Right.
It's very simple, and they'll spend the money teaching the housekeeping to fold the towels and place the soaps just right, and then you say, well, does everybody in the hotel, not just security, does everybody, the receptionist, housekeeping, back of the house, front of the house, if there's some sort of hostile event, does everybody know what to do? Does everybody have a plan? If there's a gunfire in your lobby, does everybody know where to run, what they should be doing? Oh, yeah, we had a half-hour seminar on an active shooter 2 years ago.
Right.
Well, that's
yeah.
not good enough.
Right. It was it was sandwiched in between the sexual harassment seminar and some other type of seminar, right? So a lot of these things just kind of come and go, and you feel, I would say, as if you've made a difference, and therefore you have a false sense of security because you haven't actually made a difference. So things haven't changed.
Correct. And sorry, yeah.
No, please go on, Mac. This is fascinating.
No, I was going to say there are hotels who are doing it. Yeah, I'm not blanketing.
Well,
there are hotels who are doing the right thing.
Right. It's hard. It's hard not to create a blanket thing because a major hotel that might be across from the United Nations is very different than a hotel that's located in a secondary market somewhere in the middle of the United States.
Correct. For example, when we speak about training and fire drills, fire life safety is drilled all the time, right?
Correct.
We do a fire drill every 3 months or every 6 months, according to the NFPA 101 American Fire Code. So if you say to the receptionists, hey, what do you guys do if there's a fire? They absolutely know what to do. And if you say, what happens if there's a hostile event? If there's gunfire, they absolutely don't know what to do. And honestly, if I take Africa as an example, over the last 5 years, nobody has been killed or injured in a fire in a Western hotel in Africa in the last 5 years. But over 300 people have been injured or killed in terror attacks. But yet, we do fire drills and we don't do hostile incident drills. I'm not saying we shouldn't do fire drills. I'm saying we should train for active shooter and whatever scenarios it is, or bomb threats or whatever scenario you might have. But we need it to be part of that regular training curriculum. We do refresher training, guest relations, dealing with complaining customers, all the good stuff that we do. We need to put it in the, whether it's biannual or every 3 months, quarterly training sessions.
Right.
But we need to put that in with security awareness, right? Noticing stuff. When you see something, say something.
Right.
It drives me crazy. If I see what, tell who.
Something.
Right.
It's very clear, Mac.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
You need to be more specific.
That's really tough. And then what we're also talking about is you're talking about training your property personnel, but being the devil's advocate here for a minute, is it reasonable for me to believe that the housekeeping staff or a front desk kid in college that's not necessarily getting paid a career wage is going to have the skill set to do this, or put in the time and effort that's needed to be paying hyper focused to be vigilant about what could potentially occur?
Fair question. So in terms of awareness, so the awareness doesn't really require any additional effort from the employee other than knowing that they should be doing it. So and I know that there are hotels who do this, yes? You train your housekeeping. If you go into a room and you see wires or you see blueprints or you see something that's wacky, say something. Now, firstly, housekeeping in the most part are very nervous to speak up against a guest or say anything because they're worried for their jobs. And in the U.S., there's also your firearms. You have rights, and nobody wants to say something. No one wants to get sued. Nobody wants to infer that somebody might not be okay or might be a problem. And that absolutely has to be respected. People also have the right to go to a music concert without fearing for their lives.
That's exactly right.
Right? So we have to find a happy balance, between people's liberties and freedoms and keeping them secure, which is very tough to do.
Which is, and this is the thing to me, which is the whole crux of the issue that gets discussed every time we have one of these horrific incidents happen here in the United States. We want to immediately jump towards more gun control measures, but then there's the hardcore Second Amendment folks that will not make any change. That say any change is unacceptable, then no rules whatsoever. And in one aspect, I could appreciate that, but I'm continuing to wonder, when do their rights interfere with my rights. And I think the best way to look at this is when you look at the First Amendment, we have a right to free speech. But even though we supposedly have unabashed rights to free speech, there are limitations to that. For example, the classic example of you can't yell fire in a crowded theater because that could potentially injure people. So I don't even know where this goes with the Second Amendment debate. And even if we were to put in gun control measures, for example, hypothetically speaking, would that even make a difference? Are we just, I think my question is a really long way to get there. Are we having the wrong conversation here in the United States?
In my humble opinion, and I say this with reserve because I'm not an American, I do not live in the United States.
I understand.
So I certainly will not comment on the Second Amendment. However, I think you are having the wrong discussion.
Yes.
Because, as I said earlier, there's always a weapon. The weapon is not the problem.
Right.
As I said, and we've seen that vehicles have been very effective weapons. Knives are very effective weapons.
Right.
Yes. So somebody said to me, yes, but I can kill more people with a gun. I said, yeah, but look how many rounds Stephen Paddock had. Mm-hmm. I said, and the guy with the truck in Nice killed more people with his 18-wheeler.
Right.
Right. Or with a homemade improvised explosive device. There's always a weapon. And the bad guys will always find a way. Right. They'll always find a way. Right. And the focus has to be on, for me, we need to deal more a little bit with the gunman and not the gun. Israel, one of the things that you understand when you go through the airport in Israel is they're looking at you, not at your stuff. You can bring as much liquid as you want, if you didn't know, through the Ben Gurion airport. Right. You can bring 4 gallons of water. You don't have to take off your watch. You don't have to take off your belt. You don't have to take off your shoes. Yeah. They talk to you, right? They chatted with you. Hey, how are you doing? How long have you been here? Did you pack your stuff? How was your holiday? Yep. They're looking for suspicious indicators. They're looking for the perpetrator, right? There was an example here a few months ago at Ben Gurion Airport when an Israeli citizen went through the check, the hand luggage check, and they found a loaded pistol in his carry. Exactly. So they pulled him aside, very calm, because the bag was with the security guys. He didn't have access to the weapon. A guy in his 60s, they said to him, anything in the bag we should know about? And he went, oh, my God. And they said, oh, my God, what? Right. And he said, my firearm's in my bag. Why? He said, I was going to drop it at my brother's house to lock it in the safe, and I forgot. I was rushing to the airport. I'm sorry. Right. So they took him aside. They looked him up. He has no criminal record. He is an officer in the reserves. Right? He's a good citizen. They confiscated the weapon, and they said you can pick it up when you come back. And that was the end of the incident.
And that seems like a fair and reasonable approach.
Right. Nobody tased him, slammed him face down on the asphalt, handcuffed him, and threw him in a cell under the Homeland Security Act. Right. Because he wasn't a threat. He wasn't a threat. You know, I myself was once stopped at the airport in Ben Gurion because I'd forgotten a pocket knife in my carry-on. So the guy said, hey, I said to him, oh, sorry, I forgot. He said, sorry, I've got to confiscate it. I said, I understand. And that was the end of the discussion. Right. Right? Yeah. Because clearly he'd figured out that I wasn't a threat. So I think that the discussion we should be having, and I'm not at all going down the road of profiling or things like that. It's called suspicious indicator identification. Right. And it doesn't matter who the person is, or what their color, race, nationality, religion, gender, not important. If somebody's displaying behavior that suggests that something is amiss, right, and then tell the security manager at the hotel. He will then decide whether to bring in law enforcement or inform whoever he needs to inform, or whether he should approach and have a chat with the same guest, because that's what they'll do in Israel. They'll come, they'll speak to you. Right. They'll talk to you, and they'll chat. And then from your responses and your body language, right, and your eye movement, they'll start to understand whether you're a problem or not, and whether they need to elevate the threat level. So this kind of focus that they have right now on the guns and the bump stocks and all these things, for me, it is a bit misdirected, because that's not going to really make anybody safer. And one other thing I want to point out, when these things happen, and I completely understand how terrifying and tragic they are.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, the industry is going off like, well, this is an emerging threat, right? We expect now to see a Stephen Paddock, God forbid, every other week, right?
Right.
They're responding like this is something that we're going to see more of, which I'm not convinced. So the vehicular attacks that we saw became an emerging threat. When the first one happened, right?
Yes.
And then more happened in Western Europe, and they saw, okay, this is happening with frequency. This is a methodology that the bad guys are employing, and we need to take measures to mitigate that, right? And once upon a time, there were hijackers, and once upon a time, there were suicide bombers, right? And then the security industry responds to the threats.
Right. Okay. So it seems to me then, just to like kind of try to wrap this all up, is we need to be focused on what we can control. And we cannot control something like a madman who's going to use something at his disposal in order to create harm with others. So instead, what we need to really focus on is understanding what the indicators are of those behaviors, and then training our hotel staff and anyone that's on property with some knowledge that'll help us try to stop these situations before they occur.
100%. And the last part to that is, and know what to do if something does happen.
Yep. Right. And that would be putting in not just a crisis management plan that we talk about, how to respond to the media, but actually what the folks at the hotel should be doing in a super emergency situation when something like this happens with either a stabbing or a shooting or something of that nature.
100%. Glenn, it's not that I expect the receptionist to be the hero.
Right.
To endanger his life, to run across the lobby saving guests.
Right.
But I'd very much like him to be able to save his own life.
Right.
Yes, if he's had training, if he knows, if he has a plan, as a hotel, we have a due diligence to our employees as well, not just to our guests.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if all I tell housekeeping is, if you hear gunfire, use your master key, go into the nearest room and lock yourself in. If there's a guest inside, well, that's just, unlucky.
Yep.
But there's gunfire, right? There's no time to be polite. But that means there's one less person standing in the corridor to be a potential target.
Yep. That makes sense.
Right?
Yep. Excellent. So any advice on where people could turn to? Perhaps it's AS Solution in terms of being able to create those programs that in the end will help people be more safe on property should something happen.
Look, that's what I do.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I don't want this whole conversation to be like it's going to be a shameless plug for you, but I do want you to be able to communicate that to people. So how
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But that's what we do. This just comes from a lot of years of experience in all aspects of the security industry, from executive protection
right.
To consulting to training. We ourselves bring our clients. We look after high net worth and Fortune 500 clients, and we choose hotels to bring our clients to. So we look at the hotel security from a user point of view as well.
Right.
Which gives us, a different perspective when we're doing the consulting. So I asked myself, would I be happy for my client or my wife and kids to stay in this hotel?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I want to get the hotel to. And that can be done in an intelligent, hospitality-friendly, guest-friendly manner, not by putting up barbed wire fences and big guys with guns. That's absolutely not what we need to do. We just need to be intelligent about it.
Right. And when you put up those big fences and stuff like that, you're going to wind up hurting your business and making people antsy the entire time. So it's good to know that there's other ways to handle this situation.
Absolutely, there are.
Excellent. And you can find AS Solution at assolution.com, for example. Any other way folks can get in touch with you, sir?
That's the best way. There is under our services, there's a section on hotel security, and you can reach out to me on mc@assolution.com. MC as in Mac.
Yep.
And you can reach me that way. And even if it's just to chat or get some advice or some input, I'm really happy to help.
I really appreciate that. And if you folks have any questions, comments, or anything that you want to add to the conversation, you could do that at Traveling Glenn. I'm that on both Twitter and Instagram, or send me an email at glenn@rouse.media, or hey, just give me a call. Whatever. We want to all kind of work together to make sure that everybody feels safe and secure, so we could all have a happy hospitality industry where we can all find success in our lives. Mr. Mac Segal, thank you so much for being here with me today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Glenn.
And I want to thank all of you for listening to challenging and difficult issue for this episode, but I'm really glad we do it. And I will be back on Friday with an all-new show that hopefully a little bit more fun. Thanks to you all, and see you then.
Thanks so much for listening to No Vacancy, the hospitality industry's #1 podcast, with your host, Glenn Hausman, online at rouse.media, on Twitter at Traveling Glenn, and on Facebook.com/Glenn.Hausman. We'll catch you next time.